I'm so glad that Naeem Kalwar with NDSU and Cheryl Reese with South Dakota State University are here to kind of talk about salt-affected soils. And so welcome to you both. I think for ease of understanding in this panel, because saline soils and sodic soils are different in the way you manage them, I want everybody to know that Naeem is going to focus on saline soils, and Cheryl will focus on sodic soils. So as we navigate this conversation, I think keep that in mind as we're moving forward. And I want to start with Naeem. Why do we even care about these saline areas, and why should we even start managing them?
The reason we need to care about soil salinity, for example, and for that matter, Sodicity too, but I'll let Cheryl talk more about that, because we lose hundreds of thousands of dollars every year on these kind of spots. So if I just give you a quick example, according to NDSU crop budgets, producers spend $82 to $180 per acre just at the time of planting. So I'm only talking about seed, fertilizer, and fuel cost. I'm not even considering their time. They spend that much money at the time of planting. And most of these spots, depends how high the salt levels are, basically turn into net loss. And I've had several conversations with producers too. And I'll again give you an example that one producer, for example, told me that, I paid $100 per acre as a rent to my landowner. So I asked him, I said, okay, so for example, you rented this quarter, which would be 160 acres. He said, yeah. I said, how many acres you know that your annual crop is not going to grow there? He said, about 10 acres. So I said, what is better, losing $1,000, or if you ended up planting an annual crop, say even if you spent $100 per acre planting an annual crop, losing $2,000? So that would be my reason for caring about these issues. So that's the short term. But the long term is, like I've heard this so many times during this workshop, we need to leave this land in a better shape for the future generations. So there are short term reasons we should care about these issues, and they are long term.
So I'm going to ask you another follow-up question to that. I mean, it feels like when you're managing salinity that you're sometimes just banging your head against the wall because you can make progress, and then, like you said in your video, it all depends on moisture and when that moisture comes and how much is there. And in your opinion, in the work that you've done over the last 8 or 9 years in North Dakota, what is it possible to bring these areas back, or should we have the expectation of bringing them back?
I think that we could bring them back. The example I gave, the producer example, in 2012, they basically contacted husband and wife and RCS, and they contacted me. I just recently joined Langdon Center, and this year you should have seen the wheat growing there. So there is a very reasonable chance we could bring these acres back. Now, it all depends upon our starting point. If we are starting from very high levels of salinity, and so the sodicity is more complex than salt, I would say, but the wet weather caused salinity, but the dry weather is not going to help it either. So we will depend upon getting, I would say, not too much rain, but we need decent rain to force or push those salts into the deeper depths. So there's a reasonable chance we could bring these acres back. The other thing I want to say that, I like to focus on things what I could do. So not knowing, so we see the white salt crust, okay, salinity issues there. But do we know how high the EC or the salinity level is so that we could plan to plant something which will grow there? I could always go and take soil sample. That isn't my control. I don't control the rain. I don't control the temperatures, but I could take a soil sample, get it analyzed for EC. Now I know, okay, what are my options? Can I plant soybean here? No. Can I plant canola here? Maybe. Can I successfully plant barley and oats? Yes, for sure. Well, some spots, depending upon the soil results, I may say no. I would even lose money planting barley and oats. So my next option would be to plant a perennial salt tolerant grass mix. And again, I'll let Cheryl talk about sodicity. Part of these soil analysis results would be, is there any other issue going on like sodicity? Do I need the amendments? And if I need it, is it economical? So yes, we could do that. I suggest that we should remain optimistic. We should never lose hope. We face challenges. Every challenge brings opportunity, and we should focus on things which we could do. not focusing on whether we are going to get the rain or no. To me, that we cannot control that.
That's great perspective. I think in agriculture, we could all use a few more things that we can control. So soil sampling and knowing what your problem is a great place to start with salinity. Now let's go to Cheryl and talk a little bit about expectations for sodicity. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what that problem is, and then what should your expectations be for in managing that?
Well, when I had my cafe talk this morning, we talked quite a bit about that. And Naeem also referred a little bit to that. When you are looking at these areas, the first thing you need to do is soil test and determine if your salt issue is a saline issue or a sodic issue. A sodic issue would be defined as having too much sodium, and the typical test that a farmer would want to ask Ag Vice or wards to conduct would be exchangeable sodium percent. The numbers that we look at there from that index, if they start approaching 6 or so, then we start having concerns that we have too much sodium in the soil. I believe from my experiences in South Dakota that managing soils with high sodicity is much more difficult than managing soils with salinity. Salinity, we have still the water can still infiltrate down through the soil. But if we have sodium and if we have a clay loam or a silty clay loam textured soil, we're going to significantly impede water movement into that soil. So if we want to move the salts out, it's going to take much longer time to reclaim the areas with high sodium in it than to reclaim areas that just have the salinity problem, the calcium and the magnesium salts predominating.
And so with sodicity, I mean, you can add, amendments would be appropriate. And I think you have some research on this, Cheryl, as far as amendments or management approaches. And what are you working on in that area? Or what do you recommend?
Well, in South Dakota, we've been looking at basically 3 different, tools in our toolbox to help farmers manage these areas. And Abby, you hit up on one of them, obviously amendments. There's also, people are also looking at using tile. And we're also looking at using perennial grasses. How I'm going to look at that is the first time I see a site like that, like Naeem said, you're going to soil sample it. That's the first thing we do. We got to figure out if we have saline or sodic or saline sodic. If I do have a lot of sodicity and this area is getting much larger and I'm having erosion problems, that's another thing we see in South Dakota. Is we've seen a lot of gullies formed along the edges of the fields, a lot of erosion issues with that. The first thing we're going to ask the farmer is, are you interested in trying to find a salt tolerant perennial grass that can grow here just to sort of stop the erosion problem right away? We've worked some with amendments as well. The amendments that we primarily evaluated are gypsum and elemental sulfur. We don't have access to beet lime like you have in North Dakota. The issue we have with gypsum in South Dakota is that we found that many of the sites that have sodicity in South Dakota also have high gypsum. Now, you can soil test for gypsum. Ward labs will do that in Kearney, Nebraska. It is more expensive, but you can do that. It's not something I recommend doing. What I would recommend doing that is if you do have a area that you've tested high in sodium, that you could try some amendments there and then see how well it works before spending a lot of money, because gypsum can be fairly expensive as well too. We've worked a little bit with elemental sulfur. The issue that we've seen in about probably 10 fields we've worked in plot studies for at least a couple years, looking at the amendments and what's happening with them. The big issue we've seen with elemental sulfur, and maybe you have seen this in North Dakota, but what we've seen is that the elemental sulfur, typically, you'll hear that elemental sulfur, if you apply it in the winter or early spring, it'll be available and start breaking down by probably July or so, June. We have not observed that in our high sodicity soils. We've actually soil sampled, and I've found elemental sulfur prills still in the prill form in a soil with a lot of sodicity in it 18 months after it was applied. So my recommendation is going to be, if you have sodicity there and you can't do anything about it, plant perennial grasses, soil test, plant perennial grasses, And then if you want to use amendments, try them out on a small scale before you use them on a large scale, obviously.
Yeah, that's great advice, because I think if you start thinking about these little spots on a field that have these issues, but you apply an amendment to an entire field, I mean, that gets expensive. And so Cheryl, is that what you're seeing in a field, that's sodium affected? Is it generally the whole field, or is it just parts of the field?
In probably in South Dakota, I mean in North Dakota too, we have some fields where it's spotty all over, but typically those sites are more salinity issues. And that's, more in that Aberdeen area where we have fields that are just, have a, sort of a micro relief of maybe 6 inches in the whole field. So those 6 inches, you hit a little dip 6 inches and you'll start seeing a salt issue. Honestly, truthfully, the sodium issues that we've seen tend to be, along the edges of roads, along the edges of fields. The sodicity issues that we see typically are with a classic saline seep, where you have, like a summit area and then a foot slope area. And we see that sodicity forming down in that foot slope area.
Oh, that's good advice. I think sometimes it's easy for farmers to see where these problems may occur when they're thinking about the landscape. And so Naeem, if we go to you, where do we typically find some of these saline areas, or where should people be watching out for this problem?
Like Cheryl said, along the headlands. So there are potholes, which are natural, but I would like to go back. So say, for example, before the age of humans and we built the roads, for example, water used to move naturally. Water didn't have any boundaries. So we came along, humans came along, we wanted roads. And I said that in my cafe talk session too. I love cars and I love driving. But the thing is, if you drive and if you see a saline seep on one side of the highway, whether it's gravel road or county road or highway, you'll see that on the other side, there is a similar spot. But because we made those roads, we compacted them. So now what happened? Water is not moving the way it would move naturally. So we basically have disturbed the hydrological system of the landscape. And then on top of it, while we are building roads, we dig up these trenches or ditches to raise the level of the road. So this water sits in that. So if there's a higher productive ground and there's a roadside ditch, when it rains, excess water moves from the higher ground into that ditch, and it sits there most often. These ditches are not really moving water. And even some of the culverts I've seen, they are higher than the bottom of the ditch. So the water sits there, and then the capillary action moves in. So now this higher productive ground is dry, and this ditch is basically acting like a pothole, and the water moves. This is why we see often these saline areas along the headlands. And then there are natural ditches or draws too within the fields or potholes. So most often you will see those issues around those areas.
And so if it's a water moving across the landscape, Naeem, is tiling an option?
Tiling could be an option. So here's a situation where tiling will work. As long as we have excess soil water, the basic function of tiling is to drain the excess water in order to maintain optimum groundwater depths during the growing season. So we need excess water. Under dry weather, groundwater depths will drop naturally. We don't need tiles for that. The other thing is we need good soil water infiltration, which is a function of good soil particle aggregation, whether it's chemical or biological, along with good structure in soil pore space. Sodicity issue we are talking about will result in dispersion, which will lead to poor soil water infiltration. And tiles, it's not the fault of tiles, but if we have dense soil layers, water will not move through the soil profile into the tiles. So you need good soil water infiltration, and you need wet weather, and then tiling will work. It'll help. But then there are some other things, what we have found out here. So we think that if we tiled, salts will just go away. What we found out from our research project that in 2016, we had a lot of rain and the land was tiled and the salt and the sodicity levels were high. So salts were trying to keep the dispersion low. Sodicity was causing dispersion, but salts were neutralizing that. We reduced our EC levels, say from 8, 9 to 4, 3.5. Come 17, our EC levels increased back to 5 or 6. and that was a result of capillary movement. The land was tiled. So if we think, because, and a reason for that is that tiles collect free gravitational water, but the capillary water or the wicking up of the water also can bring the salts back, and tiles do not intercept that. The plants roots can intercept that. So there are pros and cons. I would just say that under right circumstances, tiling will work. But if the circumstances are not right, we should try to stay away from that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that information. And maybe going to Cheryl, you know, with tiling and sodic soils, you mentioned it in your video, and what's some of the information that you have about that, or guidance for using that approach in sodic soils, or should it be used?
We have a site down by Stratford, South Dakota, and I mentioned that in my video a little bit, that we are working with a farmer there. It's a pretty large area, and it's about 20 acres. It's like sort of a classic saline seed. And so we start, as Naeem said, kind of up at the, at the top of the hill, and then we come down into the foot slope area. So what we did is we typically, a lot of people, they'll sample the surface and kind of monitor what's happening with the surface salts. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to get at the question, will water flow into the tile if we have sodium in the presence of that tile? So what we're doing is we have picked locations that we go back to every year where it is tiled, and we're deep soil sampling down in the vicinity of the tile. Now, it's very interesting to what we've learned in this field. So we go to the top of the hill, and we have some very productive soils at the top of the hill for corn and soybean with no salt issues. But the very interesting thing about that is once we get down into about the 2-foot range at the top of the hill, we start hitting some extremely high sodium, even at the top of the hill. And so, as Naeem said, through, across South Dakota and North Dakota, we have very similar soils. And these areas pop up because we have old salty sediments that are from old formations. And if these formations are close to the surface and we have a high water table, then these salts will always come back up to the surface. Now, with tile, what we've observed so far, so the tile was installed in 17, and we've monitored for 18 and 19. We've collected our 20 data. We're working on analyzing that right now. But what we've observed is in 2019 was the second wettest year on record in that site. And we observed that we reduced some of the sodium in the lower, 2-3 feet range on the side of the hill, but at the very bottom of the hill, we increased, or the sodium increased or maintained the same concentration, which was between 3,000 and 5,000 parts per million sodium from the top all the way down to where the tile was. And we sampled surface, we sampled the outlet of the tile as well during that year. The tile flowed throughout all of August. So we sampled June, July, and August. And we noted some salts coming out, but it was an equal portion of calcium, magnesium, and sodium is the predominant salt in that field. So we're seeing exactly what Naeem is seeing, is that we're changing that EC up a little bit by lowering it, but it appears to be the primary salts that are moving out are calcium and magnesium. And so far, we haven't seen a lot of effect on sodium. Now, this is only the 19, and the 20 will be the third year, so it's going to take time. But for our initial first couple of years in this field, we have the rainfall to move it. We haven't seen a lot of sodium moving out of that toe slope area yet.
Great, thank you for that. Now that each of you have kind of talked about these two issues separately, Naeem with salinity and Cheryl with sodicity, now I'm going to muddy the waters a little bit because we know that this issue is not simple. And so I'll go to some of the questions we have. And one was about if you have both salinity and sodicity, so if you're lucky to have both, can the amendments that you're adding for sodicity have negative impacts on salinity or vice versa? And maybe let's go to Cheryl for that one.
Like I said, we have not worked with amendments quite as much as maybe Naeem has. If you have salinity and sodicity is going to be the dominant problem. That's what I see in South Dakota. And so if you don't have, gypsum in your soil profile, then gypsum will probably add some benefit because it will help increase flocculation and reduce that issue with dispersion. Elemental sulfur, I have not seen a lot of work benefit from that. I think I can maybe, tag Abby, I can tag Naeem on that, and he can talk a little bit about amendments in North Dakota with that too. But I would tackle the sodicity problem first, because that's going to be the dominating issue to fix first.
Perfect. Let's go to Naeem and get his thoughts on it.
So I would 100% agree with Cheryl. We need to, if we have both issues. So number one, we don't need any amendments for salinity. These are water soluble salts, and they will move out with the water depending upon the weather and what's the groundwater depth. But sodicity is the bigger challenge. And this is why, because the amendments, even when we apply, they need to get dissolved in the water. So just as an example, if you apply gypsum, calcium need to separate from sulfate. So gypsum is calcium sulfate. And then that calcium will go and displace sodium from the soil particle negative charges. So if you applied amendment, the amendments, once they get dissolved, they will turn sodicity into a salt issue if they are working successfully. I don't know how long it'll take, but that will be the process. So initially your salt levels will go high, but we have to understand, I'm not trying to say that salts are good for plants, but think about this. If sodium or sodicity is trying to break down soil aggregates, salts are trying to neutralize that. So until we figure out or take care of that sodicity issue, those salts are good to have, because it's like money in your bank. So if you are tiling and your both salt and sodicity levels are high, and then in the tile water, calcium is going out, well, calcium is what you're applying through gypsum, for example, or beet lime. So if you drain your calcium, that means that you may have to apply a higher rate of gypsum. So
Tricky.
it's tricky, and it's a lot depends upon weather too. And I actually can also quickly tell you guys that we have been taking water samples from, because we have a lift station every year, 1 to 3 times per year, depending upon the water. We take samples from the lift station up the stream and downstream. And during the last 5-6 years, we have taken samples 10 times. And these are analyzed. We filter them, preserve them, send them to Department of Health. And we found out that the water which is draining from the tile drainage field is actually adding more salts, sodicity, selenium, sulfate, nitrate, nitrogen, and some other like carbonates, bicarbonates in the surface water drainage ditch, which is going through different fields and actually going to Langdon water. I'm not really proud to say that, but the thing is, this is how you learn, by doing research. So if you have a tile drainage system, and if your objective is working, you're taking care of those things, remember the water you are draining out of your field will add more salts and sodicity to surface water resources.
The one thing I'd like to ask both of you is a two-part question. So we'll start with Cheryl. Cheryl, are there any quick fixes? Can we add surfactants? Can we add other things to make these soils improve, or is it specifically amendments? And then also, what's your positive note for leaving on sodicity that maybe gives people a little bit of hope as to tackling this problem?
So when it comes to the sodicity issue, my positive note is going to be to talk with your NRCS people, and if there's nothing else you can do, plant a perennial grass. We have a site down by Clark that has sodium in it as well. It's not, when I'm talking about the Stratford issue, we're talking upwards of 5,000 parts per million in the surface soil. Sodium, that's a lot. Down there, we're talking more in that 2,800 range. But we have planted perennial tolerant salt grasses, like AC saltlander, creepy meadow foxtail. And we estimate in the first year that they really got going, that they were able to encroach upon between about 20% of those high sodium areas. And so I can't echo enough the importance of, if you soil test, if you have sodium, get a salt tolerant grass planted out there, because you do not want to let the problem get away from you. If you do, it'll become this nightmare that's very, very difficult to maintain and reclaim. I see one of the persons in here said from their personal experience that it takes 10 years of pattern tile drainage to reduce the size of my saline seep. I am going to agree with that 100%, because in the couple years that we've seen in our tile where we have a lot of sodium, we haven't seen a lot of improvement in the foot slope area. And so get something out there to lower that water table. Remember those perennial salt tolerant grasses, their roots can go down 6 to 12 feet and prevent that water from coming up, that capillary rise like Naeem was talking about, because that's what's continually bringing those salts up. That's what I would do if I was a farmer, if it was my land.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. Let's go to Naeem for, excuse me, some quick thoughts on whether you can add some kind of surfactant or spraying some kind of product on saline areas to fix those tight soils and improve drainage. And then to leave us on a positive note for salinity.
So I created a bleak picture, so I'm going to give you a positive example.
Perfect.
Depending upon our starting point, when I say that, I mean like how high the sodicity level is and how high the salinity level is. I could give you a real life example, which has been published in different magazines too. In Walsh County, North Dakota, in 2014 fall, I visited a land with the landowner, and he wanted to tile it. I said, let's go and take some soil samples. So we took soil samples, and this landscape was different. On top of a hill, big coulee going around it. So when we got there, and we were short on breath too, because we were using handheld auger, and we went 4 feet deep. So doing all that, I said, Mark, I think that you should have good drainage going into that coulee. I think that water is not moving through the soil profile. To make it short, we came back. It was a sodicity issue. At that time, the cheap gypsum source, which is from North Dakota, was not available, and gypsum was very expensive. So he ended up applying beet lime, about 16 tons per acre, on 16 acres side by side. And the levels were not super high. He went with barley crop. Next year, he planted durum. That land, you won't be able to recognize. I have 5 years of soil results. Each year, I kept going back to that 16 acre, and I took the samples. It is basically completely out of the issues, salt as well as sodicity issues up to the 4 feet depth. So that's the positive pitch. The other pitch I'm going to say that, like Cheryl said, if you tested your soil, you have both issues, salinity and sodicity, and the amendments are very expensive, and if you don't want to apply, I would suggest plant a perennial salt tolerant grass mix. They will grow there. You could actually get okay to good hay out of them, depending upon when you cut them. If you want to put your annual cash crops back someday, that's when you need to think about amendments. But if you want to leave that ground for now, you say, I've lost enough money on this piece of land or these 5 acres. I just want something to grow there. These perennial grasses look way more beautiful than, say, your noxious weeds. And you could get some income out of them too. So that would be and then that would give you some time to think about different other options. And if you still wanted to invest in gypsum or some amendments, you could do that later. As far as some surfactants are concerned, Abby, I've heard about a few things. For example, calcine, I think, is a product name, I think. I've talked to the company people. I do not have any personal experience, but here's what they claim. They are not saying that don't apply any amendments. What they are claiming is that product will break down, say gypsum is calcium sulfate, it will break it down faster. And that if for example, here's a big question mark, because I do not endorse that. I personally have no experience whether whatever the claim is going to happen. But if, say, you are able to separate calcium from sulfate faster, then that calcium can also replace sodium from the soil particle sites, if that's correct. So I've heard about that product. But again, I personally do not have any experience with that.
Yeah, sometimes there's no quick fix for these things, but I appreciate the positive note you guys left us on for salinity and sodicity, and thank you for contributing.